All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start the live stream and the recording just to let everyone know.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Welcome, everybody. We're looking forward to nice weather and another good week of learning. I think the first thing we would do before we go over the agenda is go over to approve the minutes of last week. Tripti, are we going to put that out there? I'm a little bit challenged today on my phone.
We've got 16 out of 20, which I think is about the right number. So we've got 16 participants here approving. So we may want to wait just a minute more here.
Okay.
Tony, we have about 21 people in attendance and 18 have voted. So 16 have approved it. So are you comfortable with that? Should we move on?
Yes, let's move on. I'm a little bit challenged today because I'm having problems pulling up the agenda.
I see that B has a hand up. Well, I don't know if that's on the minutes or something else, but go ahead, B.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to bring something up that has been in conversation for the last couple of weeks. From my understanding, we have been told that the recommendation threshold for this group is 60%. And then we were told that the strong recommendation threshold is 90%. In my honest opinion, and I think the opinion of other renters here, is that I think that the recommendation threshold being at 60%, when the group is less than 40% of that, or when there's 40% of not even renters in this group, I just kind of think that erases the whole voices of the renters in this decision-making process. So for me, it doesn't make any sense when not even 50% of the group is made up of renters that the recommendation threshold even be 60. And I bring this up as a concern because it means that all recommendations that are coming from this group won't even require the consent of a single renter. That is, in my opinion, not the spirit of this group, and I hope it's not. And to be quite honest, I think that it is mocking the public community process that I think we all agree to be a part of. If we're attempting to make recommendations together, I don't think that a 60% threshold really allows for decisions to be made when not even 50% of this group is made up of the people who are going to be impacted the most, which is by renters. So in a space where so many people are raising concerns about being heard, I kind of find it to be inequitable that we will be operating under a structure in which the most impacted people, not only now, but historically, which are renters and low wealth people, are going to be silenced. We know that in November 2nd, and we know that in this last April 12th, when we held a public hearing and the public comments, we saw that St. Paul residents care immensely about this issue. So for me, when we have the 60% threshold for coming up with recommendations, I find that it's kind of going to damage the credibility of this task force if we decide to continue to erase the voices of those most impacted by this issue. Not to mention just the overall housing discrimination that we see in this country. So I think a large group of us who are renters here are demanding that the recommendation thresholds for this group be at 80%, and that the strong recommendation thresholds stay at that 90%. We believe that this will allow for a recommendation, for the recommendation process and decision-making process to be actually representative of the group and actually representative of the renters who are the largest population in this city. That is our demand. We are hoping that the threshold gets shifted from 60% to 80% for recommendations, and that strong recommendation threshold stay for 90. And if that is what we decide to do, if we decide to make that shift, then I believe that a large chunk of us renters here will continue in this process. However, if we will continue to work under such unfair conditions and unfair processes as a 60% threshold, I don't think that our participation in this stakeholder group will be needed anymore, and a lot of us will leave. We will not be operating under a group that is here to weaken the policy, to silence people, and to ignore what renters have been saying for the last couple of years, but especially over the last 2 years. These are people's livelihoods that we're dealing with, and these are people's homes, their lives, and their overall well-being. So it's not an easy decision for us to make this choice. However, we understand that this policy is going to be affecting a lot of renters in our city. So again, our demand is us shifting that 60% threshold to an 80% threshold, or a lot of us will just no longer participate because it will just be a large waste of our time. So that is our demand. And we are giving facilitators and co-chairs until May 16th to decide if we're going to move along with this change in our processes or not. I know that this might be disturbing a lot of what is going on, but we can no longer operate under this type of force. And even looking at the chat right now, seeing how many of you who are against this are talking to me in a disrespectful, rude manner kind of goes into what I'm talking about. I will no longer choose to operate in such a way where I'm being disrespected when I and so many other renters in this group worked hard. We worked during the pandemic. We worked during the cold. We worked during the heat to make sure that this policy gets passed. We made sure that renters showed up during the public hearing. We made sure that renters continue to show up, and they will continue to show up. So that is where we're coming from as a group of renters. And I see a lot of you in the chat, again, just not listening to anything that we're saying. So that is where I'm at. And that is where a lot of us are at. The choice, again, is up to y'all. We are giving you until Monday the 16th to decide whether this shift is going to happen or not. But yeah, thank you for giving me the time, I guess. And I hope we hear back from you soon.
So this is Philip. That was a long speech, and I see lots of comments in the chat, and I'm sure I see other hands up. I'm sure there's other people who have things they want to say. If you look at our proposed agenda for today, we're going to be talking about the group deliberations. So I don't know, Tony, your thoughts about, do we try to dig into all the things people will want to say right now, or do we go through our agenda and come back to this under group deliberations?
I think, B, thank you for speaking up on behalf of you. And obviously, if you represent others, we need to clarify like who you're exactly speaking on behalf of. But we do want voices heard. And so thank you for sharing that. And whereas we don't, we prefer not to have demands, but we prefer to have encouragement to further dialogue. We have heard what you've said. I think we should go through the announcements, and we do have a section on here today that we're going to be talking about this, and then we can explain, why the thresholds are and get through them. And I think that's part of what we had planned today, because we had received some emails, and we had put in the agenda to talk about it as well. So let's go through the announcement, the trends, and then we do have time in our agenda specifically for that. And B is correct in saying that he's not the only one. We've received multiple emails that shared his view, and so we did add it to parts of the agenda today. So with that, I know some people say I got cut off. Can we, Philip, did you hear most of what I said?
Yes, I
Okay.
think I could hear you.
Can
Okay.
Okay, can we go through the announcements? And then, again, we will be working within our small groups today, and we will have sections to talk about that threshold. And Ed and Kira can also chime in on how we got to those numbers and how we're going to move it forward. But I don't think we have any announcements as we are set for now. If there are any other announcements that we don't have on the agenda, please let us know. But as of now, Kira, do you have any announcements that we haven't thought of?
No, we don't have any announcements, Tom.
So then we will move forward with the presentation of the rental data. So I'm turning it back over to Kira. And then Ed, can you maybe help explain what the group deliberation and how we are going to discuss the issue and challenges that be brought up before we go into before we turn over to Kira?
Sure. So before Dr. Tony Damiano provides the analysis of the rental market trends, I'm going to turn it over to C. Terrence Anderson, who will talk about the process that we envision moving forward. So C. Terrence.
Yep, I'm here. So yes, yeah, I was just about to say that B uses they, them pronouns, it's just listed right next to them. So I just want to make sure we're noting that when we're talking about them. I'm obviously not directly responding to what B just said. That's something obviously we're gonna have to continue to talk about, and yeah, I guess we'll see what's gonna happen in light of these group deliberations. So just talking about the process going forward, in particular, the group deliberations, how we're going to sort of proceed forward from coming after these weeks of learning about rent stabilization around the country. And of course, today we're going to talk about it specifically in the context of St. Paul. The ultimate goal of this group is to come out with recommendations from this group at whatever set thresholds, which obviously is a conversation that we're going to be having. For this group to make recommendations to the city council and the mayor's office around what this group views as a good way to move forward around rent stabilization. So in order to do that, we're sort of, today is going to be the first day in sort of the small sort of way about what we're hoping to do in order to get to that point of making the recommendations. Ultimately, there's two kind of overarching steps. There's going to be small group discussion, and then there'll be large group discussion. And so each of those are designed to be sort of an iterative process of having conversations with each other about ultimately the existing St. Paul rent stabilization ordinance, as well as what has been the proposed new construction amendment that is not passed, but still be in the frame of view of this discussion as well too. So in the small group discussion, which will start today, we're going to split everybody into 4 groups. We expect that the small group discussion will occur over several weeks. Small groups will be have been curated by us at Kira, as well as the co-chairs as well, to make sure that there's a good mix of different ideologies and positionalities as much as we can sort of understand it. And by positionality, I'm talking about renters, landlords, financiers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to answer the question definitively from a numbers perspective of how many renters in, because I know that's a question that folks are thinking in here, but it's less than 40% of the group about. So, but we'll clarify that number explicitly, because I know that's a question that's in the chat. So hopefully we'll have that by the time we talk about group deliberations as well. But we'll be in 4 groups, split as mixed folks around it from different positional perspectives. These groups will be facilitated by Kira staff. Today, we're going to begin the discussion with the current ordinance and new construction amendment as essentially the starting point of our discussions. We're going to start talking about today, what does this ordinance and new construction amendment do well? Considering the public and other group members, what the public and other group members have communicated through the straw poll, of course, the vote in November, and public comment that we did just a couple weeks ago. We're going to keep in focus the other design elements of the program and ask members to offer evidence for their arguments in using data to be presented that has been presented up to date, as well as your own lived experiences. We'll then continue that conversation into what does the current ordinance plus new construction amendment not do well. So sort of the same sort of considerations around that. But then starting next week, we're going to begin to discuss what a package proposal would look like. What we've largely heard from this group is that it's hard to discuss these proposals on individual policy elements at a time. What we've heard is you want to talk about the package together to kind of see what trade-offs might be depending on what's in that. And so, of course, starting with the current ordinance and new construction amendment, but group members or small group members will be able to sort of make proposals on whether that's changes or new packages. And you'll be discussing that in the context of your small group. What we would expect over the next couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And then you would vote to move a package into from your small group into the large group, right? So there would be 4 different proposals that we would expect to be moved forward to the small group. Each of the small groups will get a chance to present what they are put together in the context of the small groups. And then basically as a group, y'all would vote on one of those packages to move forward for more distinct debate around that. The co-chairs, it will be in the co-chair's discretion about when to ultimately make a call for a vote in sort of a Robert Rules of Order style vote. And they'll sort of just gauge the debate as it's been to find the right time to do that, to meet whatever the thresholds will ultimately be, to ultimately be a recommendation to the city council as well as the mayor's office. Or the co-chairs could say, hey, this is not a viable proposal. We need to put something else at the table, and they'll make that call as well too, again, through a Robert's Rules of Order style recommendation vote. And then lastly, you'll also have the opportunity to vote on individual policy elements of it. So say distinctly the rent cap or distinctly vacancy decontrol or control to see where individual folks will, or where as a group, those individual policy elements sort of fall. But again, that will be left to the discretion of the co-chairs, Philip and Tony. Then ultimately with all that small group deliberation and large group deliberation and voting, y'all will have presumably a recommendation or recommendations to move forward to the city council and mayor's office. And Kira will write ultimately in our ultimate report, reporting those recommendations. And of course, we'll be documenting the votes in the large group publicly, so the public will know how you individually vote in the large group. In the small groups, they will not. They will be anonymous in the small groups, but public in the large group. I have a document that I'll share with all of you right after this meeting that will go over this process, that will have it written down in the same sort of way. So y'all get a chance to see that, scrutinize it, and of course, we're gonna obviously have a greater discussion about this. And of course, what B and others might be proposing as well too. So that's just in general. So today, of course, we're going to the small groups to talk about the current ordinance as well as the new construction amendment, what it does well, what it does not do well. So that's what you can expect today. Next week, we'll head into that sort of proposal making in small groups from there.
Thank you. So I think then, Ed, are we ready for Tony? Dr.
Yes,
Tony?
I think we are. So then I'll hand it over to Dr. Tony Damiano, who will share his screen and go through the analysis that we've completed on the St. Paul rental market. Tony.
All righty. Let's see, slideshow. Can everybody see my slides and not my not my view?
I see your view.
You see presenter view?
I do.
We see presenter view, yeah.
All right, I get it wrong every single time. Let's try that.
There we go.
Does that work? All right. So thank you, everybody. As Ed mentioned, my name is Dr. Tony Damiano. I finished with my PhD at the Humphrey School in urban planning, and now I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Cura. Again, my background is in quantitative methods related to urban planning. And as a part of this group, I was asked to put together a analysis of the rental market. Apologize, it's taken so long. We wanted to try to find the best data available. And so part of that involved our team, including research assistants, having to manually scrape large data sets, but we're hoping that this provides is able to provide us a better picture. So again, I apologize for the lateness of this, but hope that this can at least be a jumping off point to talk about the St. Paul rental market. So just to go over kind of the data and what we're looking at here, the main source of rental market data I'm using comes from a company called CoStar. And they're a real estate analytics firm, and they track rents longitudinally. So they track the same buildings over time in most, if not all, large cities in the US. And the data, the time frame that I have runs between the year 2000 and the first quarter of 2022. Just so you understand a little more about the CoStar sample and the data we're looking at, it's a representative sample, so it's designed to match the market as a whole. They do focus on large buildings. This is one of the major limitations of these data, are that they're looking almost solely at buildings that are five units or larger. So we are missing what the market for smaller buildings looks like. However, we think that this data is useful because it does account for 74%, so about 3/4 of the rental market for St. Paul is represented in this sample. So overall, it's a total of about 550 buildings. And if you look at the units, it totals out to 25,000 units. I limit my sample to buildings that are fully market rate only. Doing an analysis looking at the rental, the distribution of rents in CoStar versus census data that it largely matches St. Paul. I do rely on some other data sources as well, in particular data on income and rents, and that comes from the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey. And the timing doesn't quite line up with the CoStar data, but it's the best we have. That sample runs between 2006 and 2019. So if we're looking overall at changes in rents within St. Paul, we see, I think, a few different trends. We see sort of pre-recession, so kind of 2008 and before. We see kind of an up and down pattern, and I'm not sure if you can make this out, but one thing to note is that post-recession, one of the differences here is while the average increase in rent is the black line here, I have a gray area here to show sort of the range of changes in rents. So I look at the 90th and the 10th percentile. And basically what this shows is that over time, we see more variation within the market, right? That there's more variation between high and low rent changes. And that has sort of increased, especially after the Great Recession of 2008. And we see the sort of the peaks in the rental market above 5% year over year increases in 2014 and again in 2018 and 2019. We've seen rent increases moderate since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So here is just a summary table to see it visually. So overall, throughout the study period, throughout the time period, rents grew on average 2.2% per year. But again, we see variation where we see, in general, lower average rent increases pre-crash and during the crash. We see the highest increases in sort of the post-crash period before COVID. And again, as I mentioned, the range of these has gone up over time, right? That at sort of the low end, some, at the low end are seeing actual year-over-year rent decreases, while at the top end of increases, we're seeing increases of 7.5%. So next, what we have here is it's the same table as the previous one, but instead we're looking at relative to the rate of inflation. And so for the purposes of this, by inflation, I mean the consumer price index for the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area. And so if we're looking at rents relative to inflation, we see pre-crash and during the crash, we see rents in general, on average, rising less than inflation. During the post-crash period, 2013 to 2019, we see rents rising at about 3.2% percentage points above the rate of inflation. And again, and then during the pandemic to present, we see rents growing about at the same rate as inflation on average. But again, we see, similarly that the range and kind of the, I don't know if you would use the term volatility, but sort of the range of changes has increased, which I think is an important part of the story. Next, in this next section, I'll break out rent changes by a few different, cut it a few different ways to get kind of a better sense of what's going on. So here's looking by building age. And so one cutoff we used, again, a lot of this analysis is very similar to what we did for the city of Minneapolis. And so I did the best I could to kind of port this over using St. Paul data. And so what we see overall is, if we look at the total, is that older buildings built before 2000 show slightly higher rent increases on average compared to newer buildings. And that starkest change is sort of in that post-crash period of 2013 to 2019. Another thing to point out again is this volatility that we see, especially in new construction, where we have year-over-year increases, especially in the COVID era, showing a decline on average of 8% up to a rise in 8% in the following quarter. So again, more volatility sort of in the new construction market, but slightly higher sustained higher rents or higher rent increases on average in older buildings. This is a similar cut. So instead of looking at building age here, I'm looking at real estate class. So in commercial real estate, buildings are rated based on sort of the market that they're shooting for. A is shooting for the top end of the market. B is the middle of the market. C is slightly lower on the market. So it's important to point out that if we're thinking about NOAA or nationally occurring affordable housing, most of that is going to be C class. And again, we kind of see similar trends with looking at class as we do with age. More volatility in the A and B class market, but on average, slightly higher increases in the B and C class compared to the A class. So again, on average, slightly higher, but again, a lot more volatility in the A and B class as well. This might be a good spot for any questions. If folks have any questions related to the use of the first slides.
There is a question in the chat, Tony. I don't know if you want me to read it for you. If you
that'd be great. Yeah, I can't see it right now.
Okay. So from Bill Lendecki, how have rents for new construction, i.e. buildings less than 5 years old, likely impacted the range of change in rents over time? St. Paul has seen a relative boom in new apartment construction in the last 10 years, and I'm wondering how rents for those apartments might have changed in ways that are different from older apartments. Yeah.
Then I also said that Tony just addressed that question. So
okay.
Okay.
I don't really, I think you covered it, Dr. Damiano.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't see the end of your question there. It was I read the first half, but yeah, cool.
All right. So next, after looking with this, I turn to the looking at the census data from the U.S. Census to try to get a better sense of how, because the previous data is only looking at sort of rents. We also know that income, right, is just as important when we're talking about housing affordability. And so the American Community Survey tracks income and rents of individuals. So that allows me to look at sort of how the rental market looks differently for higher versus lower income renters. And so I should point out that these numbers, these rental figures won't exactly match what we saw from the CoStar data, just because these are different data sets, different samples, et cetera. But I think the story here is consistent. So here's a chart that compares the average annual growth in income and rents for the top quartile of renters, so higher income renters. So on average, what we see here is that higher income renters saw on average 2.6 increase in rent year over year, and a 4% increase in income. And we see sort of stark differences if we look at the bottom. When we look at the bottom quartile of renters, so very low income renters, they show on average rent growth far exceeding income growth. Right here, we see a year over year average of 4% increase in rents and 1.3% increases in income. So again, I think this is the story here, right, is that low income renters are kind of hit with the double whammy of above average rent increases and below average income growth. And so what is the net? So first, just to plug in the middle. In the middle, again, we see sort of moderated versions of, but both the middle quartiles saw higher increases in income compared to rents. So I think that, again, the net result of this of these trends are expressed in very different housing cost burden rates. So renters in the top quartile, only 1.8% of renters in the top quartile were cost burdened. And just for reference, by cost burden, we mean a household that pays more than 30% of its income on housing costs is considered cost burden. And then conversely, if we look at the bottom quartile, almost 60%, 55% of renters in the very low income category were cost burdened in this last sample. This is another way to cut these data in terms of area median income, right, which is the measure that we use right for housing subsidies, and we can see again a very similar trend of very low income households, less than 30% of AMI, showing the highest rates of cost burden, followed by more moderate income, 30 to 60% of AMI, and then very low cost burden rates for renters above 60% of AMI. I should note that it's a very small sample here. In particular, there aren't even any higher income renters in the sample for St. Paul pre-2013. Lastly, I think of note is that we've seen growth in the cost burden rate for very low income households, but I think the largest change is post-recession. We've seen a almost 10 percentage point increase in the share of 30 to 60% AMI households who are cost burdened. This is also, I think, a good spot for questions if there are any.
So I have a question on a previous one slide back. When we're looking at this at the quartiles in here, is Section 8 VASH or some sort of subsidized rent, is that removed from this or is that included?
There's no indicator, so I don't know for sure. I removed all households paying $0 in rent, so they have to be paying some dollar amount, but unfortunately there isn't an indicator to mark households receiving a voucher or living in some other subsidized. So that is a limitation.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I move on? I'm going to skip over this one for now. So one of the issues, I think a limitation of my analysis and something we've struggled with is to really get a a sense of what's going on in smaller buildings. The previous slide I had tried to match, map changes in rental listing data for smaller buildings and compared to the CoStar buildings, but as you can see, it's just very volatile. And I'm not sure that I really trust it to say what exactly is going on in the small building market. I think a lot of this is due to the buildings that are coming on the market and not necessarily indicative of actual rent changes. So that is, again, another limitation of my analysis. But I think one thing we were able to look at is sort of the ownership structure of small buildings. And this analysis comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, who's tracked the growth of investor-owned homes, investors defined as property owners who own 10 or more small buildings, so single-family, duplexes, etc. And so we see a quadrupling of the growth of investor-owned homes in St. Paul between 2006 and 2020. And so it only accounts for 2.5% of the residential housing stock. So it's important to keep in mind that we've seen lots of growth. Overall, that rate is pretty low. However, there's distinct spatial patterns here, right? That these homes are not equally distributed throughout the city of St. Paul, that a lot of these investor-owned homes are concentrated in lower income communities of color. We see much higher rates, sometimes as much as 8 or 10% of properties in specific neighborhoods being investor-owned. And obviously this, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the geography of St. Paul, but again, we see the greater east side, the west side as well, as Hamlin Midway and Frogtown, seeing the predominance of these. And so this tool is public, it's online, and there are links to more information in my presentation.
Tony, there is a question in
Sure.
the chat from Bill. Again, it says, is there any idea why investor-owned homes are tapering off?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I could speculate. I think some of it is a lot of the low-hanging fruit is gone, right? That in many cases, investors like to do cash deals. We saw post-recession that a lot of times it was buying bundles of tens or dozens of distressed properties off the books from local governments. And so I think a lot of that low-hanging fruit has been bought up. So I think that might be having an effect. But I'd have to look into more to do anything other than speculate more than that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tony.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just thanking
Okay.
you for that. And then, as we,
Tony's not done. Sorry.
oh, sorry.
All right, got a few more. So the next section is where, predicting the future is obviously not the business I want to be in, or most researchers want to be in. But what we can do is more confidently, I think, look retrospectively and ask the question: okay, hypothetically, if there was a rent cap in place in St. Paul, what do we know about how that would have affected the market? And so on the next set of slides, we do our best to, again, this is just modeling. This is a simulation based on past data. So, but I think at least gives us some idea of what a rent cap and how different caps would have affected the market differently. So, again, here's a visualization of four caps and what that cap would have been given the state of the market in the past. So I modeled 4 caps. This was based on a combination of, the existing ordinance plus feedback from the survey, plus feedback from the mayor's office, et cetera. And so we came to, we visualized 4 caps here. So I'll go through these. I'll start with 3%. That's the easiest one, right? That no matter what the market's doing, no matter what inflation is doing, the cap on rents is set at 3%. Excuse me. One other thing I want to point out is just for reference here that 2022, right, is not complete. And so I used a Fannie Mae forecast, and they estimated that inflation for this entire year will be 5.5%. And so that's what I used for 2022. So as you can see, again, 3% is easy. It's just a straight line, regardless of what the rest of the market is doing. And what is sort of interesting, I think, is that for most of the last 20 years, we've been in a low inflation environment. The Fed tries to shoot for a 2% inflation target. And so most years out of the past 20 years, the CPI was below 3%, which means that a CPI cap would actually have been more strict for most years, especially before the pandemic started. But what we do see, obviously, are stark differences when we get to the pandemic, right? That we are in a very high inflation environment now. We've seen inflation well above 3% for the past few years. And so in most recent years, the CPI cap would be significantly higher than 3%, as you can see here. From there, the CPI plus 3 and CPI plus 7 are fairly self-explanatory. It's literally just the CPI line shifted upwards. And so the CPI plus 3 would set a cap at CPI plus an extra 3 percentage points, while CPI plus 7 would take, again, this CPI line and shift it up to limit. So again, you can see, obviously, if you're looking at the CPI baseline, CPI is going to be the strictest, CPI plus 3 is going to be softer, and then CPI plus 7 is obviously the loosest of those.
So Tony, you just have a question in the chat from
Sure.
Chong Huang. Dr. Damiano, can you say more about the relationship between inflation and housing costs, given that inflation measures the change in prices of many goods, not just housing?
Right. And so the reason I'm focusing on inflation and CPI is because these are what most different cities that have rent stabilization, the common measure is to relate it to the consumer price index. But I think, as Trom points out, that CPI is an imperfect measure. It doesn't measure income, right? It's measuring costs. And so I think it's important to note that if inflation is going up a certain amount, it doesn't necessarily mean that incomes are going up by that amount. And I think that's when we see, especially for low-income renters, that cost burden rate increase. And again, of course, these are average. CPI is an average for the region, and so measures like this are never going to be able to account for all people's situation, whether you're an owner or a renter, right? That these are general average guidelines designed to create as fair rules as possible based on the broadest subset as possible. But we know that there are always edge cases and people experiencing different things. So it's not a cure-all for mitigating individual circumstances. And this is the same, this is the same graph as before, except I just overlaid the actual average rent growth from the CoStar sample, just so you can kind of visually see the relative growth and decline of rents with inflation. So if you focus on the black line and the green line, and sort of the pre-recession era, again, we see rents generally rising below inflation. Post-recession, up until the COVID pandemic, rents are rose much more rapidly than inflation. And then now we've seen sort of rent increases moderate a bit, and inflation largely rise. And here's again the same data expressed as a table, just to get a sense of like what these different caps would have. What is the amount? What is the cap in actual percentage? Right. That obviously easiest one is the flat 3%. 3% no matter what, doesn't vary at all. CPI on average, if there was a CPI cap in place, this would have limited rent increases to about 2.5%. But again, this with a range of at the high end. So in high inflation environments, this would have capped rents at 5.5%. But there was actually a few years with deflation. And so it would have been negative. And so what that negative growth means, I think largely depends on policy design. I think most places that use CPI, what I've seen is they don't force property owners to lower rents, but it would cap that as a no increase year. Or in some cases, some cities also have a minimum that they'll say at a minimum, regardless of CPI, you can raise rents by 2%. Again, that's a policy design option. And then moving down, right, we just see all of this with the CPI plus. So if there would have been a CPI, a cap of CPI plus 3, the average allowable year-over-year increase would be about 5.5%, with a range of 6.1 percentage points between 8.5 and 2.5. And then CPI plus 7 on average in a given year in the past, the average allowable rent growth would be about 9.5%, and this would range from 6.5 to 12.5.
Here's another question. Bill, do you want to just say your question? Or I can read it. The question is, seeing articles around the country with stark increases in rents. St. Paul and Minneapolis seem to have the lowest rent growth in the country in 2021 and 2022. Any idea why?
I think that's a really good question. And again, I'd have to speculate. I don't know what the demand situation has been, right? I think we're kind of in a weird spot, whereas other speakers have pointed out, we have one of the lowest vacancy rates in the country by a lot of measures, which would suggest we would be experiencing a lot of rent growth. But the statistics don't really bear that out, that compared to other places in the country, we haven't seen double-digit rent increases across the board like other places. So there's definitely more to this story, and I don't know again if it's a demand side story, right? If the Twin Cities aren't seeing the same population growth or job growth as other metro areas, or if there's something else going on. But again, to say any more, I would just be speculating. But I think that's important to explore going forward for sure.
And there's a question from Richard as well.
Yeah.
Again, if you don't mind sliding back one graph.
Sure.
Or slide. So did you look at other indices or other things that may more accurately mirror rental costs? Like CPI, there's some times where it goes a couple of times in this graph where it seems to be going the opposite direction. So were there other things that were considered that might be used other than CPI?
We didn't. I mean, there's nothing stopping, obviously, people who write the ordinance from, pegging rent, pegging the cap to whatever sort of index they want. I just haven't seen it. I think the only other sort of different one is there's a city or two in New Jersey that use CPI or the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures average rent growth, metro rent growth, and so they use that. But other than that, cities in the past have universally used some version of the consumer price index. So
Sure.
we stuck to that for the for
Okay.
this analysis.
Right.
And Kevin, do you have a question there?
I do, and I apologize if I misunderstood this, but this is the average, right? This is average rents versus caps
Yes.
that we're looking at, but
Yes.
obviously the caps any rent increase, and so that average is made up of higher and lower rent increases, the gray area that we saw before. And are we going to see how the different caps would have constrained actual rent increases? Is that coming up? So I should just wait.
Yeah, I do have some slides on that.
Okay. That's great. Thanks.
All right. So I'll jump to those. I wasn't sure if I had time or not to jump into those, but am I good on time?
Yeah, go for it.
Co-chairs? Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, continue.
Okay. Oop, you don't want to see that. Okay. So here again is again, this is hypothetical, right? I can't go back in time and guess how property owners might have acted differently, right? If there was a cap, right? There's always a chance that property owners do something differently or something like that. But again, this is if holding all things constant, I guess is the academic way to say that. We can see how different caps, what share of the sample units it would have affected. So starting with the loosest cap, CPI plus 7, again, has a very small effect through most of the 2000s. And we do see a spike where 30% of units would be capped in this scenario. And then we see that kind of decline pretty precipitously after that year and kind of stay below 10% since then. Going to the next most stringent cap is CPI plus 3. Again, it's going to track very similarly, and we see CPI plus 3 limiting, rent increases in 60% of units in the sample in its peak in 2014, and we see that slowly decline over time. Next is over CPI, and we see CPI have a larger effect, again, not shockingly, and so we get some kind of edge effects here, I think, where there's a large number of units that are right around CPI or slightly above regional CPI. So it hits close to 100% of units in 2000 to 2002. We see a brief spike in 2006. And again, this same pattern during this high rent growth period of 2012 to 2019-ish. We see it hit that cap. And then lastly, which is the most interesting because it's a flat cap, is initially, again, in sort of this low inflation environment, the 3%, the straight 3% cap shows maps very similarly to the 100% of CPI limit. Then we see that through big parts, again, of this high rent inflation period, where 3% actually hits a fewer number of units than CPI. And then we see that climb again, where the 3% hits a slightly higher percent of units, about 30%, in sort of the post COVID period, or sorry, pre-COVID, during COVID, wherever we're at with this virus. And so to sum everything up, average rent growth in St. Paul during the last 20 years was 2.2%, and it peaked in 2019 at around 5% per year. Again, the smaller building market is much harder to measure because, at least as far as I know, there is not systematic tracking of rents the same way as there is in larger buildings. But as we said, one thing we do know is we've seen a growth in investor-owned homes in St. Paul. Another important trend is that even as average increases have declined slightly, the market appears more volatile in a lot of ways, and like with different buildings and moving in more different directions than we saw previously. And this volatility is more present in newer buildings. Again, though highly variable, when we're looking at construction class at C-class buildings, which are most likely to be NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing showed slightly larger increases in rents compared to A and B class buildings. When we move to looking at the ACS data, we see again that low-income renters experience high rent increases on average, while also seeing much lower income growth than other groups of renters during the study period. And again, this is reflected in high rates of housing cost burden, especially for very low-income households. Analyzing the caps in the low inflation environment of the past 20 years, the CPI cap was the most strict, with 3% sort of in the middle, and obviously CPI plus a percentage being the loosest. However, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been in a high inflation environment with inflation rates above 3%, which again would make CPI be less strict than the 3%. So that's what I have prepared. Thank you. Again, if there's time, I'm happy to answer any other questions people have.
Well, thank you, Tony. We appreciate it. Phil, if there's any questions in the chat, we can address those. Otherwise, Phil,
there are a couple questions. So Julie and then Arlene.
Oh, this is Arlene. My question, Dr. Damiano, was what again does Class A and B refer to? That's the higher income. Could you repeat that?
Sure. So in general, again, I'm not an expert on real estate classification. So if I'm saying this incorrectly, someone please correct me. But in general, A-class buildings are buildings that are aiming for the top end of the market, or they're going to have more amenities. A lot of new construction tends to be A-class. B-class is sort of in the middle. In my sample, it's very small. There aren't a lot of B-class buildings in my sample. And then sort of generally older housing, existing apartment buildings and things like that tend to be C-class.
Thank you.
I can read Julie's question unless Julie, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I'll ask my question. It seems as though rent stabilization is here because we lack affordable housing units. That's really the crutch of the problem. We need more affordable housing units. If we build more and add more inventory to the market, there'll be a shift in the supply-demand ratios. In your opinion, would adding more units be positive for the supply-demand ratios and render more stability in the rental rates?
Yeah, I think it's obviously hard to predict, exactly what's going to happen, right? I wouldn't want to say increase of X units leads to X outcome. But what the literature generally says, right, is that more housing in general leads to smaller price increases on average. There's a lot of complicating factors, right? Like when we talk about filtering and sort of as new stock gets added, older units can filter down and become affordable. Like that happens, but it can be a very slow process. And I think there's obviously, right, literature also says that different types of housing can have different effects. That market rate housing can have some effect, but that subsidized affordable housing can have a greater effect, especially for mitigating rent increases for lower income households. So yes, I think to to answer your question shortly, I think that adding supply can have a very real impact as well.
So there are a lot of comments in the chat. Some of them are questions, some of them are comments, some of them are somewhere in between. I think having people raise hands might be most helpful, but I just encourage people only if you have a question for Dr. Damiano, not to make a point about the larger debate. We'll be moving on to that soon. But there are some questions in there. It's just a little hard to keep track when they're all coming in the chat at once. So can folks raise hands if you have a question and we'll call on you? Yes, Richard.
Yeah, my question's probably somewhat related to, I think, Julie's question. In your opinion, is a rent cap the best way to deal with rising housing costs, or are there better solutions for the Twin Cities, for St. Paul?
I mean, as a researcher and as a member of this process, I'm not sure how comfortable I am taking, a stance on a particular policy. I think my general approach is both and approach. I don't fundamentally see policies related to rent stabilization or new supply as being in any sort of fundamental conflict. Obviously, there are better, there are ways to make it work better than others, but I don't really have an opinion about prioritizing one versus the other in this context.
Thanks. Next is Trom, and then, oh, sorry. You're just saying thank you. Next is Trom, and then Kelly.
Yeah, Tony, can you say more about like filtering and how long it takes for new supply to really make a dent in the deepest need pockets of housing? Yeah,
and so we do know that again, like as I mentioned before, that new housing, regardless of income level, does help. It's just always a question of how long does that take and how quickly do these processes tend to happen. And so there are kind of different ways to look at it, right? In the long term, it takes these units generally anywhere between 30 and 50 years, again, based on our best estimates, to filter from the top to the bottom end of the market. But there also is research showing that new supply can have some positive impacts in the short term as well. Whether those impacts, again, are enough to truly reach the low end of the market, I think is up for debate and is a very contested topic right now in the field. So I don't want to comment too much on that.
Thanks. Kelly, I think your hand maybe went down, but did you have a question?
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Damiano, for this information. Was there any research looking at the permit decline in St. Paul? That I'm looking at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development that went through January of 2022. And we really saw those housing units falling to just under 200 units per month, where those needed to be up in the four figures at least to keep on pace, or at least to try to make a dent in that supply need that we have.
We did not analyze. I did not analyze this, so unfortunately, I can't. I can't comment on that.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Dr. Damiano? All right. Thank you again, and I'll pass it back to Tony.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Well, and Philip, I might pass it back to you as we move on to the next session. You were going to go over the rationale about the emails with those concerns, and then we can open up for comments before the small group. Is that correct?
Sure. So back to where we started today with B's concerns and statements around the thresholds. I thought it would make sense to just walk through again a little bit of the thinking that led us to the 60% and 90% thresholds, and then to open it up to see if people have additional comments or discussion. I know there were a lot of people trying to get in at the beginning of the meeting, but we wanted to go ahead and get through the research, which was great. So now we're back to discussing that, and hopefully then we'll be able to move into our the first of our small group meetings that C. Terrence outlined earlier. So the 60% and the 90%, 60% for a recommendation, 90% for a strong recommendation, came directly from the Community First Public Safety Commission or Task Force, can't remember what the term was, that met and deliberated and made some recommendations, many of which the city took action on related to public safety. There's a few things about those specific thresholds that I just want to name, and also about the process that we've outlined that I want to name. The first one is that all of this is going to be reported. However we vote on whatever we vote on will be in the report. And so we are just a recommendation-making body. Ultimately, the city council, Councilmember Tolbert, and the other city council members and the mayor will be making whatever decisions they make and factoring in our recommendations however they choose to. And it seems really important that they have all the information about the deliberations, the packages, the voting. And if there's an important difference from their perspective between 61% support for something and 82% support for something, they'll be able to see that. So there's nothing sort of magic about the thresholds. They're just ways of saying what counts as a recommendation of this group, what counts as a strong recommendation of the group. The second piece, which was mentioned earlier, is that the voting itself by individuals will also be public. So the city council members and the mayor will be able to see how everybody here voted. We're an accountable public body. We need to show at the end of the process how each of us have voted. And if it's the case, to some of the concerns that Bea was expressing at the beginning, and that we've also heard from other task force members prior to this meeting, if it's the case that all renters or renter advocates who are on this group vote against something, I can't speak for the city council and the mayor, but I would think that that would be something that would matter to them. Whatever level we set as the threshold for a recommendation or a strong recommendation, that's all going to be public. And then the last piece, just in terms of the rationale that led us to this, is the Community First Public Safety experience. Any thresholds we use, any voting process we use isn't going to be perfect. There's no right answer here of the best way to do this. But the fact that a very contentious set of discussions around public safety was use this process that they worked with the Citizens League on, and it was generally perceived, certainly not by everybody, but generally perceived as something where people's voices were heard and reflected in the results, and where there were some very strong majority positions that then the city was able to take action on, seemed like a good reason to take the same approach here. So that is just somewhat reviewing things that I talked about a couple weeks ago as we were laying this out. There's been discussions back and forth, emails back and forth with different task force members since then. Obviously, everybody heard what Bea expressed at the start of the meeting, and it seems appropriate here to open things up for people's comments and questions. I would say because there are so many of us and there were many people who wanted to speak earlier, we will call on people who are speaking for the first time on this topic first, and then loop back to people who have spoken already. So I see Catherine's hand up.
I think if the group were evenly divided, that what you're saying would make a lot of sense. But because it is not evenly divided, then a 60% would not reflect our voices. So I think we need to speak to weighting the lower group of renters somehow. That's my concern, that the group is not evenly divided fairly.
Thanks, Catherine. Bill.
Yeah, just a comment that I had at the beginning, which to me, I think 80% is too high. I think that means we won't make any recommendations here. The group is a lot of different folks from different perspectives. Some are renters, some are landlords, some are homeowners, some are, we've been all over how many different kinds of people are here. And, but 80% means that we won't make any recommendation, I think, other than very vague one. And that to me would be really disappointing because I think we've all spent a lot of time here trying to work on understanding. I would hope that that work kind of turns out into something, that we actually end up with a proposal that we can bring to the city council and that they would find useful. But I don't think we're going to get agreement at 80%. I think 60% is a supermajority threshold anyway, and that's a probably good bar. So I'm against changing it. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Are there others who have not spoken on this topic yet who would like to speak? And if not, oh yes, Traum.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm coming to this as a homeowner, and I recognize that our goal is to come together to make decisions and recommendations. And I think that we should not be trying to come out with recommendations at any cost when that cost is to effectively erase renter voices when they're the most desperately impacted by this issue. And as we've seen in much of the data, low wealth BIPOC renters are the ones most struggling from this issue and the most impacted by it. And so, me coming from this as a homeowner, I feel like I want to be a part of a process that honors everyone's voice. And like Catherine said, if the makeup of this group were a little bit different, then yes, the 60% threshold, a different threshold would make so much sense. And I think that given the imbalance, and hopefully Kira can confirm with us what that balance is, we have to recognize the role of power in this conversation, right? And I don't think that's been discussed enough. Who holds power in decision-making? Who holds wealth in our communities? Who has more homes than they need when there are people who don't have any? I think that's something that we need to think about. And I think that this recommendation threshold is really critical to making sure that we can honor every voice in this process.
Thanks, Drum. Malik and then Arlene.
I think the 80% threshold is possible if we have some other topics on the table. I think kind of how it's proposed now, I just don't see it being sustainable. I think the only way that this becomes sustainable where it becomes a stability issue and adding rental units, which in turn is going to allow fair rent rates for multiple levels of people that need to rent, is having other conversations. Having conversations of holding landlords accountable for not making repairs on properties, not letting landlords be retaliatory if a tenant takes them to code compliance court, giving them extensions on leases. Like, these are the conversations and the tools that we could use to help tenants become stable. The tenants brought the conversation to the table. You guys have a lot of politicians and ears wide open and being creative to try and figure out solutions. You should also try and get solutions of money. They're offering stipends in other states to make housing affordable. I think that should also be a topic. But to only have the conversation of the rent cap, it just seems like a very narrow-minded approach to look at a bigger issue. And if we're looking at holding landlords accountable, I think we need to start looking at some of the conversation that does that. And I think a reasonable person, and I'm a landlord, and that's why I wanted to be on this board, is because there are some landlords that are doing things they shouldn't be doing. But this conversation isn't holding those landlords accountable, making it habitable for tenants.
Thanks, Malik. Arlene.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what is the makeup of the small groups going to be? How is that going to relate to the kinds of recommendations we're making in terms of, if there are more, say, landlords represented in a group than are renters, how is that going to, influence what the recommendation is, what the packages that we're going to be putting forward, how, what will that impact be? And how are the small groups going to be chosen,
I
selected?
think let's respond on that one before we get to the next question. I wonder, Terrence, do you want to respond to Arlene's question?
Yeah, that's a good question, Arlene. Yeah, so generally we tried to map out, of course, the broad representation of this group. So again, into the classification of, as I think someone posted in the chat, all sort of signed up under this guise of whether you're a developer, you're working at a bank, or whatever it is that you're individually representing. And of course, that these I think folks in this room broadly have identified themselves as either being pro the rent stabilization policy to some extent, or against the rent stabilization policy in terms of how you voted, or if you would have voted in last November. And so we're looking at, some of those sort of data points across each of you as individuals, and looking to balance the groups as much as possible to get, again, the full participation of folks and not let one group sort of overrun the other in the context of what the proposals that come out of the small groups or this group in general. It is generally true that that renters are the minority group in this group, quite significantly, if like individually identified as renters. And most like industry folks, I think if you can broadly call it, are the majority representation of this work group as a whole. If you just classify that as all, that doesn't mean that all of you see the same thing or believe the same thing or have the same inclinations around this, but if you just identify industry folks as a broad group, that would be, of course, the largest classification of folks. And then, of course, there's periphery folks in between that too. So we tried to balance all that as best as we could, given the makeup of the group. So there's no one group in which, say, industry folks are the sole members of the group, but they tend to be the majority in each of the groups that we have identified. But it is balanced as much as possible.
And just also on the same question, there's been in the chat the request for Kira's staff to report out how many people are renters. I've been exchanging messages with Ed, and that data doesn't currently exist, so we would have to do a poll. There are some people who were identified as renters in their appointment or have identified themselves as such, but there hasn't been a poll that asked that question specifically. So if that sounds like that's useful information for folks, we can do a poll and then report out the results. I see Richard next.
Yeah, I think we're being a little simplistic when we say exactly where people come from. Being pigeonholed as only one role is just really isn't good recognition of where people come from. Yes, that's an aspect of who I am professionally and personally, but it's not my only aspect. I care about the city of St. Paul. I consider it broadly as a whole. This group was handpicked by the mayor and the mayor's office, which means that he chose people that are able to see different perspectives and from different standpoints. We just spent the last 7 weeks on education. If we're strictly about what our role is, then that whole 7 weeks was pointless if we only have a position. I don't believe that to be the case. I don't believe that to be true about this group. I think this group and the people that are in this group are able to see beyond their individual roles and see what is best for our community as a whole, for our city as a whole. And I guess I would kind of, whoever was speaking a little bit before, maybe it was Malik, I'd kind of echo his comments as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. It looks like, Terrence?
Yeah, just to reclarify, we're not pigeonholing y'all in terms of like where you work as being your position on rent stabilization. Of course, there's a diversity across homeowners, across renters, across people that are in the industry. So I just want to explicitly state that that is not our view, that your position or where you live or how you live is how we're classifying y'all in your total position around this.
Right. Comments made earlier made pigeonholing very clear. So.
DeAngelis.
I think BU is up before me, unless that's an old hand.
No, I spoke before already, so you go ahead.
All right. I think there's, I think this evidence, kind of research today, just reiterates kind of what's been going on the last 7 weeks, is that the unspoken reality is that there's two rental markets. There's a bucket of renters who are doing very well that aren't cost burdened by anything that's going on, and they're living their best life. And then there's a bucket of renters who are heavily impacted by every decision that's made across policy landlords, sales, and the entire kind of market realities. And this blunt object of a policy impacts both sides differently, and it works to serve and benefit renters on one end, where it really doesn't affect the renters on the other end of the spectrum who have still free market choice to move about throughout the region. And so I would just encourage more nuanced look at how do we address the target populations that have been the most vocal in the renter conversation that I've seen and been a part of, to make sure that we're protecting them in the conversation, as well as with new housing choices.
Thanks, DeAngelos. B.
Yeah, my comments come from just the overall behaviors that I have seen within this task force and outside of it. This policy came together because a large chunk of the community who are renters have seen that our elected officials were not doing enough. This policy was community-based, community-led, and the community made sure that this policy passed. And the reason why they did that is because there aren't any protections right now in place for renters to fall under. When we see renter protection ordinances get passed, they often get reversed, like we saw in 2019. So renters ran out of options in terms of what is going on to them. And I believe that when we're looking at this, to say that being a renter is a role is just a little disrespectful, because it's not a role. Being a renter is something you're either born into or sadly you fall into. So it's not a job that we just woke up and chose one day, like you all one day woke up to chose to be a developer or a landlord. Good for y'all for choosing that, I guess. But we as renters, we did not get to make that choice. And we probably won't have a choice on whether or not we get to be renters for the rest of our lives. That is in the hands of people like y'all who have so much power and have so much authority in our communities, when that was not consented to the people who are suffering in our communities. So I am just tired of us looking at renters as if they are some little made up character. These are real people with real experiences. And I feel like I have to continue to say that, because no matter how many times we say that, it seems like a lot of folks in this group don't quite understand that. Even during the public hearing, I felt like so many people were questioning the authority and questioning the knowledge that renters had when they showed up. And renters showed up because they care about this issue. They showed up in November, they showed up in April, and you better believe they're going to keep showing up regardless of this goes. So there isn't trust. There isn't trust with elected officials. So Councilmember Tolbert, I'm happy you're here to listen to this, because there is no trust. There's no trust with the mayor's office. There's no trust with city council. And it's true, because people came together, created this policy and voted for it, and they organized their neighbors for it. And it's not because they want to discredit those elected into office, but they're out of options. They're out of options. And for us to sit here talking in the comfort of our own homes when people are out there not even with a home, I think it's just in itself says a lot. And I think even the makeup of this task force, the fact that we have meetings in the middle of a workday when not many renters can even attend, the fact that we don't pay people to be on this task force, it's like this task force was not made for renters. However, the recommendations better at least reflect what renters are thinking about if we're going to keep moving forward. And I think that the renters in this group have done a really good job of putting up with all of the disrespectful comments and disrespectful claims that have been thrown against us when all we're trying to do is survive. And that's what is very frustrating for me. And I understand that so many of you probably see me as this mad person, but I am just overwhelmed, and I am overall just exhausted for the renters who are less privileged than I am. And I'm not even the most privileged person in this room. A lot of you are. So for us to be sitting here talking in the comfort of our own homes about something that is going to affect 1 million people, yes, I would like it to reflect those who are being impacted by this policy. If we're not going to bring as many renters into this space, we might as well have at least a fair process that will get their voices heard. Otherwise, what are we doing here? And I understand that Mayor Carter put this together, but even the way that it was put together, it doesn't reflect what St. Paul looks like. So that is where I'm coming from. I never mean any disrespect, and I never mean to be rude to people, but we are dealing with real life issues, with real life people dealing with real life struggles. And I think a lot of you just choose to gloss over that. And I am confident in making that claim just in the behaviors that have been exhibited by so many of you towards me, towards other renters in smaller groups, and overall towards your practices outside of this task force. So that is all I really have to say. Again, if we choose to not go to that, if we don't choose to move from 60% to 80%, then you can say goodbye to a lot of the people who truly are embedded in the community, who have worked hard in the community and continue to work hard. So that is all I have to say. Thank you.
Next up is Marcus and then Ronson.
Thank you. I kind of agree with Malik and D'Angelo. Thank you very much, B, for that passionate conversations there. You know what? As a renter, another one, and my comments in the chat, it seems like renters are screaming out for protections. Rondo, back in the day when the freeway came in, they got displaced, no protections. Senator Garofalo, for the Senate offices, when he stated that we should go back retro and get rid of this ordinance, effectively trying to erase my vote. When we came to this point to scream out for help, that's what this task force is about. I don't know where this us versus them keeps coming from. There's two different sides, it seems like, renters versus homeowners. We understand you're getting your point across with the cost and your burdens, but as B keeps on saying, these are real lives. When I spoke at the city council meeting, I introduced myself as an unintended consequence because I'm displaced as a generational renter for 30 years. I've been on the west side since 72. And our fourth owners that came from southern Minnesota, past Mankato, bought the place. They want to turn it into Airbnb. My suggestion, if this doesn't work, if some kind of protections don't come our way as renters, we're not asking for zero rent. We're not asking to keep protecting the people who aren't paying rent. They're squatting and all this and that. You have renters who are generational, and we just love our communities and we want to stay. When I gave a speech last Juneteenth, it's like keep locals local. If you look at what's going on throughout the United States, so many people are getting displaced. When my building got bought in November, I just moved in my new place in April. I ran into people from Rondo coming to the west side looking for a place. West side, Rondo going to the east side looking for a place. East side's coming over here looking for a place because of the unfair practices. So what we're asking for is just in some of your earlier presentations, stability. Like I said, let's just kind of we can bridge the gap, people. There's 41 people on this Zoom call. I feel just listening. That's why it took so long to raise my hand. There's enough brain power here where we can come up with an amicable solution. It doesn't have to be an advocate just going at each other. Let's come up with a solution, fair protections. You guys can do the homeowners and builders, stakeholders. You're getting enough breaks from the city, from the state, federal, to help you pay your bills. Those of us who are senior, disabled, veterans, we have one check a month that we have to split up and divide and pay all of our bills and make it work. So when you guys are talking about, well, they're complaining about their bill, their rent going up, and it's a place to live. You got a place to live. Come on, people, let's just get some kind of amicable solution. We got how many weeks left, Phil? And Cure, I'm sure we can get something done.
Thanks, Marcus. So there's two other hands up we're going to go to, and then hopefully we'll get started on our small groups. There's nothing in the small groups part of the process C. Terrence outlined that is directly about this threshold, so we should be able to dig into that process as this conversation continues. But before we do that, Ronson and then Clara.
Thank you. I just want to kind of echo what Marcus and B and Catherine and Trauma are all saying, that the privilege of being able to come to this group and come week after week is ridiculous. The people who really need this policy can't be here. And it hurts so much because I know personally I've been screwed over by at least one real estate related person in this group who at the beginning of the pandemic let people without masks into my immunocompromised mom's home, and they claim to be a socially conscious realtor. So I think that's just ridiculous. It's so hard to continue to come to these groups and listen to people talk without any compassion or any real care. I don't know. It's ridiculous.
Clara?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I've been sitting back and I've been listening. I at one point when I first joined the group, I was talking a lot. And then when I got into the group, I kind of scaled back, almost wanted to leave the group because I don't understand why you guys don't understand. You know, I've been out here talking to the renters, knocking the doors. There are people are about to be evicted at the end of this month. There are people sitting in the shelter want to be access to rent a property. And Malik, I just understand why you don't understand, because most of the stuff that is affecting these renters are BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and Latino communities are sitting out here paying rent that they can't even afford. When I knocked those buildings, people were saying that they would have to leave their homes because they would not afford to stay in their houses. These people, there's a lot of renters out here are living, and including me, living in here in unhumane conditions with rats, roaches, lead paint. Don't even have enough money to pay rent. How can people, like if I've been a single parent all my life, it's women out here. Sometimes I know women out here working 3 jobs to pay this rent. That's not fair. Minimum wage is only $10. They just show you the data that the rent is going up, but the wages are not matching the rent. The city council members know that. The mayor know that. I think they brung me into this media and try to persuade me to stay here. I'm not even getting paid for this time that I could be working on something else. I decided to run for office so I could do something about what's going on. Because I don't believe some of the tensions in some people in these meetings are not intentionally here to want to work together. All the disrespect in these meetings, I don't want to be a part of nothing that people's not going to be able to work together. If we can't get the politicians to get on board with what we're saying, and you guys can't get in the same room and listen to what we're saying people are living in extreme conditions. People don't see this. Landlords don't see it. Some landlords don't even live. They telling tenants you don't like it, living in this building, you can get up. That included me. When I start complaining about the trash everywhere, how the tenants are responding, how stuff is going on in the building, told me if I don't like it, I can leave. You know what I'm saying? I put up with a lot to stay here because if I leave this building where I'm going, I had 6 rental checks on me when I came into this building. I don't get why you guys don't understand. I see a lot of classism in this group and it needs to stop. You know, it's a lot of renters in this group and we're listening. And it's a lot of renters out here are struggling. There's women and children sitting in shelter right now because they can't even access an apartment because people started doing this redlining process where eliminating people from coming into it. Malika, I just heard you say, you get a voucher or something? Where you gonna get a voucher from? Where you gonna get a stipend from? I ain't get a stipend even to be in this group. So I just can't believe I refuse to stay here and listen to us being under attack. We was one of the people that got on the ground, did a grassroots organizing, knocked all these doors, signed all these petitions, delivered a petition to Ramsey County Election Office where I work at, did all this hard work to come down in here and like striking that judge down when the judge struck the ordinance down because people saying they don't want people in the buildings. Who do you not want in the building? Where are we gonna go if we can't rent your buildings? No, I'm not middle class. I'm not high class. And if I was, I still wouldn't act this way. You always want your renters to live the way you're living, to be somebody. People need to be able to afford. The biggest takeaway from this should be, we want renters to have affordable housing. We want the rent to be stabilized and capped by 3%. So people like and other people that's working hard on the boots on the ground to be able to afford one day to be able to afford a house. I've been here 30 years in this state. I still don't own no house. When I fell one day on the ice, the old lady walked to me. When I fell on the ice, I walked down the hallway. It was in the middle of the night. It was like midnight. This lady remember me knocking on the door in my building, Rent Stabilization. She said to me, she said, "Sweetie, I want to talk to you again. What you doing Rent Stabilization?" She said, "They gonna went up on my rent, and my rent is $2,000 for one bedroom. I can't even afford to stay here. I said, you know what you should do? You should move." She's working. This is a woman in her late 60s working. Say, with that, what you paying in, you could buy you a house. So I'm asking you guys to understand, because if you can't understand, I can't be here. I refuse to be here. I didn't come here to argue back and forth with this rent stabilization. It's gonna work. You know what I'm saying? Because people need to be able to, end of the day, to be able to put some money in their pockets. People in here won't be able to afford no gas, no food, can't pay their insurance, can't pay no phone bill, because the rent is going up every time. They ain't living in no condos and no penthouses. You guys should come over in St. Paul and look at how people really actually living below their means, while you guys are sitting there living in your fancy houses and stuff. I'm not gonna be a part of this madness anymore. So you guys, if y'all want to work together, we could work together. If you don't want to work together, it might be the last Zoom call you see me on, because I could spend more time on my campaign than sitting here and listening to people go back and forth with each other. I'm not just about to do this with you guys anymore. I thought you guys brought me in here to say, how is this rent stabilization policy going to work, and what is not working? What are we doing wrong as landlords? What are we doing as investors? Because you're definitely not investing in the Black community. As I said, I've been here 30 years. I ain't seen no investment in the Black community or the Latino community or the Asian community. And if I any community, I apologize. But I people, if they get $100, $200, $300 more rent, they're gonna be evicted. They are evicting people out of my building and throwing their furniture in the trash like they don't even matter anymore. So that's all I say. If I'm gonna stay here, we're gonna work together. If not, the last.
Clara, I'm sorry, but we have lost your audio. It was kind of coming in and out for a while, but now it's out. I see Robbie's hand is now up.
I'll be really quick. I just wanted to say I've really appreciated.
You can count me out for sure.
I've actually really appreciated this group, and I'm sorry to hear that others here have had such a negative experience. My experience here in our small groups and in the group at large has been good, in the sense that I feel that we've gotten a lot of information, and I think that the property owner side of things, from what I have seen personally, I think there is empathy and understanding that there is an issue here. And I think the question, and this is what I think is really key for our group to try to hone in on, is there's no question that there's a problem. There is a problem. There's an affordability problem. The question is, how do we address it? And what we have in front of us is the rent stabilization ordinance. And my understanding and what we're tasked with here is to get together and look at the ordinance and listen to each other and see what we can decide together based on listening to each other, what we can come up with and agree upon. And so I just I am here to do that, and I want to do that. And I would hope that people don't leave this group. You know, I'm glad that you're sharing how you feel, and I hope you hear how I feel right now. You know, I think that we have a good opportunity here to work together and to listen to each other. And I think we should try to not generalize about each other and make assumptions about where people are coming from, unless you really have, you know, true data on that person about that. So like I said, I'm not trying to minimize anything anyone has said. I just, I have really walked away from this every meeting, appreciating all of you and appreciating what you've had to say, and feeling really regretful about the situation in this city, because I love this city. I love St. Paul. This is a city that I grew up in, and my family's been here a long time, and I want my neighbors to be healthy, and I want them to have stable housing. And what I don't want is I don't want something to happen that's going to hurt that. And I think, on the renter side, I understand the affordability, and I think on the other side, I understand where there's concern that there could be an adverse effect to what we're doing if it's not done right, where it could actually hurt affordability. So I just, thanks for letting me talk. I would just encourage everyone to just keep on this and not give up, and let's just try to talk and listen to each other. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And yeah, what's most disappointing is clearly, when I hear the points about some people not feeling respected, I think that's something that we all got to address. So I think we need to all check what we're doing. With that saying, is the best part of these are when we can talk and meet with each other and have dialogue. So I'm turning over to C. Terrence to talk about the small group. So at least we can have some discussion today, and where we can actually have conversations and not just feelings. So we can go back and forth and talk with some of these things. So C. Terrence, you want to take it over?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. So, I have been doing work like this for a number of years. And one thing I just want to sort of point out is that I recognize, of course, there's a lot of feelings in the room. And these feelings are valid. And I mean, the feelings that B has expressed, the feelings that Marcus and Claire has expressed, and I hear Malik and I hear others that are talking about the lack of the other conversations that we could be having, as well as sort of the support for the existing structure. And then there's a whole lot of people who are not talking in this room right now, right? There's a whole lot of you who are not even on camera. And it's difficult to connect with folks when we're not sort of present in such a way digitally, to really understand where each other are at. And so there's a lot of folks who are speaking a lot, and there's a lot of folks who are not speaking at all. And the goal is for each member of this group to be heard, right? And that's the goal of this process, ultimately. I want to recognize, too, that, so our intention is to go into small groups, but I'm also cognizant of time. We're at 2:40. Sort of what we're hoping to do, and the presence today was to present about the existing ordinance itself, to make sure that we all fully understand the existing ordinance, as well as the new construction amendment that was proposed. And I know we're running short on time for that. So, or Ed said he has time to do that. But I want to just make sure that we're all taking a second to pause and reflect beyond just sort of your innate actions, or sort of your intuitive reaction to what's been proposed today. Because the truth of what I hear is that folks feel unheard, both folks who are renters, but also folks who are in the industry that feel unheard in different ways. And so I think that it's important that we find a way in this structure that allows this process to move forward, with folks to be able to present themselves and show up in good faith. You're all here to do something very important. At the end of the day, you guys are hoping not to waste your time in doing this. And I think it's a big thing to make sure that all folks are included that showed up originally a part of this group, to continue to be part of this group. And so I think we can find a way within the structure to do that. I don't think we can, I think we can go into small groups today to have some level of discussion, but I think we should also just take some time to reflect and come back next week to do sort of the big part of the work, which is to talk about how does this ordinance work well, and what needs to be improved about this ordinance from your individual perspectives. So what I'm going to propose today, and I'm hoping that y'all will all agree, and I think I'm going to invite folks who are not on camera to come on camera, because I think it's really important that we're present with each other right now, more than anything. If you can't, I understand that, of course, too. It's not a mandate, but just I'm asking that for folks to be present in such a way. My proposal is that Ed will go and talk about the existing ordinance today, and then we'll go into small groups just so folks will know which small group that you're in. And then we end the day with that. And so next week we'll come back to talk about what does the ordinance do well and what does it not do well. You can use the time in the small group to continue to process this discussion that we're already having. So if there's more to say, especially for the folks who have not talked this whole time about what your needs are, I think it's just important to not view just like there might be just a couple people saying this. Maybe there's more of these feelings than we know about in this room. And so if the goal really is for us to find that point where we can all work together, then we all need to show up and be here together and voice what you really need so that we can truly understand each other without being judged in that sort of way. Does that sound like a good way forward? So simply Ed proposing and then go into the small groups to be introduced to each other and continue this conversation until close. Does that seem like a fair way to continue forward for today? Maybe just use the thumbs up emoji, or just use your thumbs up if that works for you as well too. Okay, so it seems like generally that's a good approach. So I'm going to pass it to Ed, who's going to go over the existing ordinance real quick. We'll probably come back and do this next week again, and then we'll head into small groups as well too. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you, C. Terrence. Thanks to all of you who have provided input. So we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, just a quick refresher, because we're going to use this as our starting point for conversations in the small groups. And the starting point is the existing program plus the new construction exemption. So just as a reminder, the existing program sets a 3% rent cap year to year. There is vacancy control, that is, there is no vacancy decontrol, right? So a vacant property makes no difference for its being covered by the rent cap. The third major element of the existing program is that it does provide a process for the reasonable return on investment. And again, the ordinance passed by the voters did not detail what that process is like, but it provided for it, and the city is filling in the gaps on that. There is an exemption in the existing program for housing where the tenant payment is based on income. But that's really the only exemption that exists, right? There is no exemption for small units or small buildings or owner occupied or single family homes. And then what we're adding to this final package is, of course, this issue, which we were asked to add by the city council, which is a new construction exemption. So we're asking you to take this package as your starting point and use that to organize your initial conversations. And really what we had wanted to do was prompt the discussion with these two questions, which is, what does this ordinance, this current ordinance with the new construction exemption, what does it do well? And then what does it not do so well? And if you're having trouble sort of understand or defining well or not well, I would refer you to the 12 objectives of a good and effective rent stabilization program that we all agreed upon last month, or maybe even before that. And so that's the context that we want you to work within. And as C. Terrence said, we don't have a lot of time left today, but perhaps there's enough time to get into groups and have a round of reintroductions and set the stage for the beginning of conversations beginning next week. So Tripti, if you want to put us into groups, or whomever's going to.
Yeah, I think some people have popped in and out. So I am actually in group 2. And so you might just see me a little bit late. So just give you that heads up.
There's also a link in the chat to a Google Doc where you can write down your thoughts to those two questions, which is, what does the current ordinance do well, and what does the current ordinance not do well? You should all have writing privileges, so find your group on that Google Doc, and you can begin there.
I think we're going to do that next week, Ed. I think we're just going to introduce each other in groups, and then we'll come back next week to do that piece.
All right. Sounds good.
Okay, Tony.
So are we coming back to convene and dismiss, or are we just dismissing?
That's why I was just going to double check, but it seems like a lot of people have dismissed. So I think I'm going to leave. It looks like that's what most people are doing.
I will dismiss as well. Enjoy
All
your
right.
day.
Take care, Maisha.
Yep, you as well. Bye.
That must be it. There's no big group.
No, there's no big group. Hey, since I've got you just for a moment, do you got a couple minutes?
I sure do. I actually started writing a message in the chat, like, can people hang out a little bit longer to talk? Just to have general open conversation, just because I don't think we get it enough. It's just so scripted and time crunched to get on and get off.
Yeah.
Just curious on different perspectives. Just don't seem to give it a good dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, for people who are on the channel right now, the official meeting, I think there's some other people that popped in from some other small groups. So I would say the official meeting is over, and we know that people have other commitments. And so if you have to get onto your other commitments, absolutely get going. If you've got a few minutes to hang out and chat, feel free to do that too. So I'm gonna hang out here for a bit. And I think we're closing breakout rooms. So we might actually see a few more people coming, because I do still see quite a lot of people in breakout room 3 and breakout room 1. So
we should also end the live stream.